some of our draft strategies and goals for both building materials and refrigerants. And then I'll give you just an overview of the schedule and where we're going after this to actually release the plan and try to get it approved by council this fall. Okay, so this is a, pretty basic, just framing the issue here. We're obviously in a climate crisis, and we're changing the Earth's climate. And so we know that if we don't do something about this, then we're going to be in a very bad place. Oftentimes the conversation was around 2 degrees. Now we see a lot of the conversation being based off of 1.5 degrees. And so we really have thought about the urgency of ensuring that we're doing our part, especially as a city and a country with wealth, and just what our level of responsibility is for acting aggressively when it comes to addressing this. And at the same time, I mentioned that it was really important to the group to ensure that we focused on racial equity as part of this. And so I do want to give a little bit of history. So the city of Austin has an equity office that started in 2016. And the way that they define equity is focused on racial equity because that is the primary determinant of quality of life outcomes. And so racial equity is achieved, or it's a condition when race no longer predicts a person's quality of life outcomes. And so when we think about how that plays out in the plan, we're really thinking about it in the context of health and economic outcomes and cultural outcomes. So just keep that in mind as we go into the themes that we've chosen to focus on. And so this is a Venn diagram that we created that really kind of helped to see how these issues are interconnected. So we know that focusing on climate change means eliminating the use of fossil fuels, thinking about all of renewable energy, clean transportation options, thinking about our natural environment, thinking about our consumption choices. And then we also know that we live in a world where safety, economic outcomes, access to services, participation in city processes is not equal. And so when we think about how we can mesh these two together, we developed a series of 7 themes. We consulted with a lot of other cities who were doing racial equity work and evaluations in their climate work. We looked at a lot of organizations like Greenlining Institute that are really a guiding force for this type of work. And of course, consulted with our equity office and how they've developed a tool for internal equity evaluations within departments. And so we came up with these 7 themes, and I won't spend a lot of time talking about them now because we have another slide on that, but it's basically thinking about everything from health to accountability to community capacity, accessibility, etc. So why equity and climate? It's oftentimes we think about issues like a pandemic or climate as great equalizers, right? It's like, oh, well, everybody's affected. But we know that it's not true that everybody's affected equally. Communities are impacted disproportionately. In this particular case, we know that low-income communities, communities of color, are disproportionately affected. So we have to just recognize that when we're talking about climate change and climate hazards, that we are not all suffering the same consequences. And, at the same time, we have to make the connection between, exploitative forces towards the environment and, how those also exploit people. And so, and that's not to focus on a deficit sort of thinking, because these communities that are resilient and that have been affected by crises over and over have a lot of local knowledge, have a lot of expertise, have a lot of connection to the land that we can learn from. And so a huge principle of this was to really make sure that we were giving communities of color a seat at the table, but also letting them lead decision making. And then lastly, that, if we design solutions for those that need them most, that, that'll benefit everybody. And so lastly, you know, just a reason to not be neutral and to not just not proactively address equity is that the systems that are in place are inherently unjust. And so if we're not proactively addressing equity, we're perpetuating injustice. And so those are some of the kind of beginning principles. So now I'll give a little bit of a history about climate action in the city. So there was a climate protection plan released in 2007, and it focused on various categories ranging from municipal operations to, you know, energies that Austin Energy could take on, building efficiency, thinking about communities, thinking about local offset options, and it had 17 actions in total. And so, you know, from there, the Office of Sustainability kind of started off in Austin Energy and then has moved into its own office since then. And so a lot of actions from here have been, are ongoing, implemented, and some I think have just evolved or are still, you know, in the process of trying to be implemented. And then we have a 2015 community climate plan. And this climate plan was based off of the goal of being a net zero by 2050 in community emissions that was set. And this one had 4 categories and was really thinking about, you know, community-based emissions and industrial processes, waste, transportation, electricity. And this one had 130 plus actions. And so when we were looking at the lessons learned from this plan, it became clear that there were a lot of actions and most of them were qualitative. So really a lot of, you know, things that we should look into, things that we should try, but not a whole lot of quantitative measurable outcomes. And so for this particular process, it was really important to try to trim down the number of actions and try to really develop sub-targets and be a little bit more short-term. I think this one had 3 phases. It's like, here are short-term goals, medium-term, and then long-term. And now our goals are really written in the horizon of 2030. So trying to think what's feasible in the short term and how will we be able to measure that success. And so just to give you a little bit of history, because so much of what we do is based off of council directives. So we do actually, Austin was one of the chosen cities for the American Cities Bloomberg challenge. And so we do have a climate advisor that is part of Natural Resources Defense Council, and that has been helping with municipal energy efficiency and electric vehicles and other transportation projects in the city. And so that has been, you know, a really big part of continuing our work. And then in May, our council also passed a resolution that called for us exploring what a community climate resilience plan would look like, and also voice support for the Green New Deal and its tenants. And then in August, we were one of the, you know, I think last I checked, like over 1,400 governmental entities that had declared a climate emergency across the world. And then when we think about 2020, there have been obviously a lot of events that have, I think, shaken our society to the core, you know, from a really small, so we included this, in February, we had a series of community workshops, and in one of the locations that we went to, we actually couldn't get the lights on, and so we had to get creative and open up the doors and try to let natural light in and try to just make it work. And so that was just like an example of us kind of kicking off the year, like trying to, you know, make sure that we were able to get what we needed to get done despite any obstacles. And then of course we, you know, I have to say we had a lot of community engagement work planned from our ambassadors program that really got derailed because of COVID-19. And of course, you know, I have to say that as somebody who works in an office, that I'm very fortunate to have been able to work from home, and we know that that's not the case. So we have to just think again about COVID-19, and we have to think about the inequities and in who's being disproportionately affected in this city. You know, both with in the concept of who's getting infected, but also who's suffering the most from medical consequences that are severe, and why those comorbidities exist. And that is all rooted in health inequity. And then, of course, recently we've had a huge mass movement and uprising in the Black Lives Matter movement. And really, this is not new. You know, this has been a struggle that Black communities and communities of color have been taken on for a really long time, but it really feels like it has taken a global scale, and we have a lot of allies in the movement. And so I think it's really great that, you know, we can continue to do this work and say that we center equity, and to know and understand that, you know, police brutality is one end of the violence spectrum, but the work that we do as institutions, as companies, and who that benefits and how it benefits communities, like all of this is interconnected, right? Like they're all like ridden in the same forces of society. And so I think it's really important that we don't see these things as separate. We know that, you know, the liberation of Black people is connected with ensuring that everybody has access to clean energy and clean air and clean water. It's all interconnected. So we do have a parallel resilience planning process. What we'll be going over is primarily a mitigation plan, but you know, as I mentioned, there are several council resilience directives to look into building a community resilience plan. Our office did release a city assets and operation focus plan that really looked at how, like, you know, emergency preparedness. And so the 4 hazards that we really think about here in Austin are heat, drought, wildfire, and flooding. So it's really looking at all the elements of that. And then hopefully in the near future, there will be a plan that addresses, you know, not just climate resilience and those emergency preparedness aspects, but social and economic resilience, and all of these aspects that we need to think about that are interconnected. Okay, and so, you know, this is a mitigation plan. I mentioned that there'll be another community resilience plan, but we also have a lot of other plans in the city. There's Water Forward, which is a 100-year water plan, really focused on resilience and also water efficiency, and then the generation plan, which of course is pivotal to helping us meet our climate goals. And so that plan has a goal of 100% carbon-free energy by 2035. There's, you know, Project Connect for Cab Metro. And so there's a lot of moving pieces, that's just to say, and the community climate plan is trying to align and just add to the mission of these other plans. And so this is our structure. We basically had a steering committee that really looked at equity, is looking at kind of the at-large issues, like how are we going to implement this? You know, how are we going to structure everything? And so really big picture. And then there's a parallel large institutions working group for, large businesses or institutions like University of Texas. And then we have 5 different advisory groups. There are 2 focused on transportation because transportation is a really huge area where we need to reduce our emissions. And so one of them is really electric vehicles, and the other one is really like getting out of cars. And then of course the building and natural systems, and consumption and natural systems are really brand new sections for this particular plan. And then I'll go over our community climate ambassadors program, but we did recruit a group of 12 individuals to do some engagement. So this is just to show we ended up, with about 120, over 120 people in the plan that were recruited to be in our steering committee and in our advisory groups. And we did host a training. We hired a community organizer named Dr. Tanya Ward, who has a lot of experience in Indigenous rights activism and the People's Institute of Survival and Beyond. And he developed a one-day training for our participants that really did a great job of understanding local history in Austin, redlining, environmental justice history, and then planning, and then also gave us some good tools to examine how white organizational culture shows up in our institutions and our conversations, and how to dismantle that within our process. And so that was our justice litmus that we kind of used in our discussions throughout. And then we also hosted a series of community workshops where we helped, they were open to the public, and we provided food, and we offered child supervision activities if necessary to try to eliminate barriers to participation. So I mentioned briefly that we had a Climate Ambassadors program. This was a pilot initiative that we had that we really wanted to find a way to authentically engage with community groups through a trusted source. And so the original idea kind of stemmed from a promotora model, which is, taking somebody that's a trusted community member, and they have conversations with, their community members in a setting where, maybe government isn't always the best mediator for that. And so the idea of these ambassadors was to have them not just do like an education initiative. Hey, we're going to educate you about everything having to do with climate change, but to really have authentic conversations about what they perceived, sustainability and climate action to be, what they knew about it, what their perceptions were of what's being done in the city, any feedback about what they see in their neighborhoods that can be improved. And so it's important to note that we also compensated the ambassadors for the work. We ended up with 12. A couple of them were actually working on behalf of their organization. And so they, hosted events. This was another thing that was a little bit, I would say largely affected by COVID-19, because a lot of them had planned to have in-person gatherings, in-person events, and it ended up having to all go digital, which I think they honestly have done a fabulous job of adapting to. I've read a lot of the reports from the events that they've hosted, and they really did a wonderful job of getting the work done despite having a completely different change of circumstance. And so and that's just to say, so we were specifically seeking historically underrepresented groups. So that was, BIPOC communities, youth, LGBTQIA+, refugee and immigrant communities, et cetera. And so we ended up with like a really good group of, diverse types of organizations and communities. And so we're still learning a lot from it and how to improve, because it is a pilot program, but it's something that, I've seen as being a really successful part. A lot of the timing was different than what we wanted it to be because of COVID-19, but really, really great program. So I'll really briefly go over our equity tool. So basically when we were writing our strategies and our goals, we really wanted to have some form of screening process that allowed us to look at, whether a strategy was equitable. And so we looked at a lot of existing equity tools from, our equity office, from other cities and organizations, and pulled out several themes, and then created screening questions or borrowed screening questions, and kind of adapted everything to our setting. And so those 7 themes that I went over earlier are really, co-benefits of climate action. And so how do these strategies improve mental and physical health? How do they, lower and stabilize living costs? What about access to opportunities, but also access to green spaces and transportation? Just transition is rooted in really knowing that we have a lot of economic opportunity available to us from all this climate action. And so we need to be very explicit in ensuring that those opportunities are targeted at the communities that need it most. And community capacity, that's just to say that we have a lot of work to do with building relationships with the community. And a part of that means also elevating and strengthening those communities and providing resources so that a lot of this work, they're already leading, and sometimes it's just like needing a boost. And then cultural preservation is thinking about cultural history and present heritage. And this has a lot to do with the fact that displacement is a really big issue in Austin. And so a lot of communities of color have been displaced, and a lot of that culture has been displaced with them. And so what can we do to make sure that, or to at least not be a part of that displacement, to mitigate. And then lastly, accountability, which is a really important one that I think we still have a lot of work to do in. But this one is about just, what can we do to measure everything, to measure for success, and to also have qualitative and quantitative measurements of things and ensure that there's data from both ends. And so this is the process that we use for the advisory groups. It is adapted from the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, which is the framework that our equity office used for their evaluation of different departments. And you basically start with really being aware of the history of the place that you're in. What is the history of the city? What are the inequities based on that history? And then where do we see disparities from the data? And then lastly, when you're writing your goals and when you're writing your strategies, is equity in mind in both of them? And are you thinking about that history? And then, we wanted it to be iterative. So we had these strategies written, we took them through the equity tool, then we added or adjusted the strategies as needed based on that evaluation, and are continuing to make edits and make sure that it gets better and more intentional. And then lastly, the point that we're at right now is how do we ensure accountability and communicate results? And so something that the steering committee is really thinking about right now is implementation, accountability, reporting, who's going to be in charge of making sure this gets done, all of these things. So that's something that we're still in the process of figuring out. So I wanted to just show you an example of what the screening questions look like. So this is the first theme. And the way we set this up was, we defined what does health mean as far as this goes. And then here are 4 questions. Every single theme only had 3 to 4 questions. In this case, it's focused on air pollution. Then it's also focused on longevity, mental health, and then ecosystem health. And we rated each one as being either the strategy is harming this, it's neutral, or it's benefiting. And we really didn't want to get too bogged into a specific score that we were hitting for. The idea was mainly to say, let's have as many benefits as we can. If there's a negative, let's talk about it. Why is it a negative? What can we do to try to prevent it from being negative? What do we need to recommend in order to mitigate that? Okay, and so I mentioned that there were 5 goal areas in the plan. And so basically we have, 2 new sections, and consumption of goods, I think, has been changed to food and product consumption now. But this was really looking at, and I'll go over kind of the umbrella goals, but this was really looking at not waste necessarily and what we throw away, but what do we buy? What do we purchase? And, you know, what reuse, kind of circular economy type of thinking. The buildings portion, I mentioned Austin Energy has some pretty aggressive goals, and they have a whole plan on their generation and targets for renewable energy, and they also have and demand response goals. And so what we wanted to focus on were anything else, you know, those gaps that we see. And so those three ended up being thinking about natural gas, so that's another source of our emissions, so electrification, and then embodied carbon, which is, you know, not in our inventory for scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, but it's something that we can certainly do and think about and should from a global perspective. And then refrigerants was another thing that we added to our inventory that we're focusing on as a gap from the existing initiatives. Natural systems was really thinking about sequestration. I know they have some on regenerative agriculture. And so that one was something new, but it's really looking at the aspiration of having negative emissions, right? And so, you know, if we reach neutral, can we go beyond that and account for historic emissions? Transportation and land use is focused on, you know, really mobility and some affordable housing. And then electrification focused on, you know, electric vehicles for personal vehicles, but also thinking about electric buses, electric bikes, and just the opportunity, you know, there's a lot of opportunity there where if we can transform the single occupancy vehicle use to be electric, that's a huge deal. But at the same time, we want less cars on the road, right? So you have to do both. And so this shows you just our data analyst developed this kind of tracking tool on Tableau that toggles around, you know, different perspectives. So this is just to show, you know, if we implement these strategies, you'll see this big dip right here. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but this blue part on the left is Austin Energy. And so once these strategies from the generation plan are implemented, you'll see a big dip in those emissions. And as that gets smaller, then the other parts get bigger, like the natural gas combustion, which is why we wanted to get ahead and start thinking about those emissions. And then here in the transportation, you'll see that there's a lot of emissions and there's a lot of aggressive work that needs to go into to get this to happen. And then the rest, you know, are here are waste. There's a zero waste master plan that's working on that aspect of the work. And, you know, there's also industrial processes that I think are an ongoing aspect of our collaboration with large businesses. And so today, you know, we're going to talk about embodied carbon and building materials. And so this is just to show you, you know, what we're talking about when we say that. Oftentimes when we talk about like net zero carbon buildings, we're really talking about operational carbon, right? But a lot of the conversation is shifting to embodied carbon along with that. And so this is looking at everything from the point of extraction to, you know, any form of emissions during construction, you know, any disposal. And so this is just to show a preview. I thought this was really easy to understand visual graph of what all those emissions that we're talking about when we say scope 3 or embodied carbon are encompassing. And so we won't get to talk a lot about the first bullet, but I did want to just kind of give you a big picture look at what the goals for sustainable buildings are. And so the first one is based off of net zero operational carbon buildings and building electrification. And then we have a refrigerant leakage reduction goal that Sarah will go over, and then a reduction of embodied carbon of building materials that Dirk will go over. And then I did, because, you know, this group is interested in embodied carbon, I wanted to just give a kind of preview of what the food and product consumption goal looked at. So they have 3 goals, and one is focused on pro-climate, pro-health food system access, and really thinking about you know, equity, so food access, but also thinking about health and the type of food that we're eating, and then thinking about, you know, having it be pro-climate, local, low carbon. And then there's one on institutional, commercial, and government purchasing, so thinking about the impact of large institutions. And then the reduction in disposal rate is based off of just like consumers, and really thinking about that as a measurement of changes in the, you know, the way that we consume what we consume and the amount of it. Okay, so with that, we'll have Dirk start over, and Dirk, just let me know when to advance.
Okay, that sounds great. Or I may be able to advance, but we'll see. So thank you, Phoebe. I'm Dirk Kestner. I'm Walter P. Moore's Director of Sustainable Design. I'm here in Austin. I work with all of our offices, and my background is as a structural engineer with a focus on materials, specifically the environmental impacts of them. So Phoebe mentioned the strategies that we're looking at across the plan, and I'm going to dig into some on the building materials. And there's a very important asterisk that I want to point out, because we got a couple questions when we talked about to the code chapter yesterday. This plan is still in draft form, and we're working for adoption later, but these are the direction we're going, and this is the draft. So Phoebe, you can go ahead and flip. We've talked a lot about you know, climate and community and health, and I think as we start to have this discussion, it's really important that we come back to a couple key points, because these came up through our discussions in the plan. And when people talk about impacts and ingredients and EPDs, or environmental product declarations, and health product declarations, this plan is trying to, you know, accomplish both elements. But it's really important to understand that when we think about the way that building materials right now are disclosing either their impacts or their ingredients, they're not the same. These are different documents, and there's not really a there's not necessarily an overlap or a nexus of a low carbon material necessarily being a healthy material. It may be, but just because it's low carbon doesn't mean it's healthy, and vice versa. So when we think about this, an environmental product declaration has the impact information. So that's when we're thinking about the climate measurements, and we're talking about these scope 3 emissions that we're adding in for the products that we're buying to build our growing city. That's where you have the embodied carbon information. The health product declaration, that's the ingredient side, and there's other labels that focus on materials health, but that doesn't really have necessarily mean that it's low carbon. So we just need to be mindful of that as we move forward. Phoebe, you can flip. And one of the things that we'll come into, or should is that in our later strategies, working with material suppliers to understand the impact numbers of their materials and have very specific information related to materials that owners and design teams are either buying or specifying. And that it's important to reiterate that these EPDs, as we talk about these documents, could be at the industry level for a product. It could be more specific for a specific product, or even for a product manufactured at a certain plant, because there's variability there. And just kind of an example of that for people who haven't seen an EPD, it's the impact label that is analogous to the nutritional label that you have on your food. And I know my little floating heads are over the right side of the screen, so if you need to move it on your screen, but these units, it shows that embodied carbon per functional unit of material. So let me see if, yeah, Phoebe, can you flip? So the goal, with that background, the goal that we have for building materials in the climate plan is that by 2030, we're going to reduce embodied carbon of building materials used in construction by 40% from the 2020 baseline, with a target in terms of absolute emissions of 500 kilograms CO2e per meter squared, which is about 100 pounds per square feet. This is a 2030 goal. I think for people who are deep into this, that a baseline is very hard to define, but what our approach is that by using a 2020 baseline, that will give us some time to understand what that number is, in the next handful of years, so that we're there at 2030. And then the absolute caps come from what some other cities are doing. We kind of validated this with some of the West Coast cities. They're taking a similar approach. And that's also the limit in the ILFI zero carbon standard right now. That's kind of where these references came through. So we can go to the next slide. As we looked at this, we had 5 areas we wanted to influence, and they are shown on the screen. They will come up through the 4 strategies that we decided on, so I'm not going to read them all, but these were the 5 areas we were thinking about of, where we had a lever, how we could move the needle. So then we can go into the 4 of them. The first is to lead by example, and that the city of Austin design and construction specifications and the purchasing agreements would be crafted to result in lower carbon healthy buildings. And that could encourage low carbon materials, strategies like whole building LCA that look at the building as a system, really from the carbon side. And then from the healthy side, we have the healthy certifications, the healthy building certifications, as well as elements of building reuse and deconstruction, because the best thing you can do to lower embodied carbon is find out how to use what you've already got. We can go to the next strategy, which is to incentivize this behavior, but really look at how we can integrate low carbon building materials and deconstruction practices into incentive programs. What levers do we have? And this is where this is draft and being discussed, but how could we include this into, say, the point structure for permitting, PUD guidelines, or AEGB, starting with voluntary starting as a voluntary program and then moving to something that would be implemented into planning and development agreements as the market moved up, which is a good segue to the third strategy, which is education. We know that this is new. Even hearing other cities in Texas discuss their climate plans, a lot of them still stay within the geographic boundary for the inventory. Adding scope 3, I think we all agree, is a great step that's important for a city that's growing. But we need to have a framework for educational programming, not only for those of us within the industry, but also the general public, and being mindful to maintain a focus on low-income communities and communities of color. So we look at the life cycle impacts, both in environment and health, of our procurement practices. And that's where we get into the EPDs and HPDs. And then finally, the piece of partnerships, to really prioritize partnerships with local markets to decarbonize the high impact materials. Because Austin is a growing city, we have the opportunity to help shape markets and suppliers that are being used to build our city. But then once that behavior or that process is learned or improved, it could go on and be applied in other cities where they may not be explicitly asking. The materials that we identified are probably the ones that people on CLF have been aware of, kind of talked about as the higher impact materials, but glass, steel, aluminum, and concrete, those core and shell materials, high impact, but really used for largely the life of the building. But we also added in drywall and carpet, because while on a unit basis it may not look to be as impactful, because of tenant improvement and churn, when you take all the reuse of that or the demolition, it can add up. It kind of segues back to the piece of developing deconstruction markets. And of course, as we do this, we want to leverage what else is going on in the country and align with those efforts to make sure that the outcomes are equitable, and we can incubate opportunities. So I think with that, we go to Sarah.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Talkington. I work for Austin Energy, the community-owned electric utility for the city of Austin. I work for the Green Building team, and I've been at Austin Energy for about 13 years. So I feel like the story of the climate protection plan has been a common thread throughout my career. And kind of my first month on the job, our general manager was laying out the plan, and I just thought, like, wow, I'm in the right place. So we've been at this work for quite some time, and I'm really excited about this refrigerants category. It's a so as a child of the 90s, there was this thing called the Montreal Protocol, and it had to do with the ozone layer. And it's widely, I guess, the story I've been told as an environmentalist is that the success of the Montreal Protocol was one of the like formidable ways in which environmentalists really felt like they could make a difference in the world, particularly with overarching policies. So this was an instance where the United Nations got the world together to basically agree to a plan to eliminate ozone destroying chemicals from our refrigerant process and other chemicals. And it happened in the 90s and has been widely successful in that we no longer hear about the hole in the ozone layer or worry about that being a cause of certain destruction. So one of the things that was perhaps an unintended consequence of the Montreal Protocol is that what we learned from it is in reducing the ozone depletion aspects of refrigerants, what we were perhaps unintendedly doing was changing the greenhouse gas impacts of these refrigerants. So, and this isn't like a minor thing. We talk about carbon and its impact. We talk about methane and it having this huge impact at, 25, 26 times the impact of carbon. Well, refrigerants are on this whole other scale. Their damaging properties to the greenhouse gases are at a scale of 1,000 to 9,000 times the carbon impact. So refrigerants are this really like technical conversation that is extremely relevant to the concept of climate change. Like this is a critical thing that needs to be solved in order to address this problem. And it's a global problem, and it's one, I guess, the United Nations has framed into the context of like the wealthy nations that have caused global warming really need to be the people who take the lead in this. So the plan that they have set forth is phased, and it calls for the global policies in place to reduce the amount of harm that these refrigerants are doing. And these policies went into effect here in the United States last year, and they'll continue to go into effect throughout the world over the course of the next 10 years based on your country's economy. So the destructive properties of refrigerants in the United States has already begun to be ratcheted down. That said, the thing about refrigerants is 90% of the problem with refrigerants happens at the end of life of the equipment. So all of these refrigerators out there, all of these air conditioners out there in the world doing their thing, they're fine unless they leak or are no longer of service. And so when these pieces of equipment move to the scrapyard or to the junkyard and there isn't care taken to safely remove these refrigerants, that is when the harm is done. So all of this is to say, we have 30 years basically to address this problem. There isn't going to be, this isn't something that can be put off. This is something now and critical. So it's just kind of an introduction on refrigerants, why it's important, and how we drafted these strategies. Next slide. So our goal is to reduce community-wide greenhouse gas emissions from refrigerant leakage by 25%. And we are basing our numbers of what we think refrigerants are in Austin based on EPA standards. And there's very little known about the local impact of refrigerants. My gut on this is that our refrigerants quantity is probably higher than the EPA averages. I think that's the case because we're in Texas and because of our climate and because we love cold beer and we love air conditioning, but we don't really know. So that's another area where we hope to be learning more. And a 25% reduction is, over the next 10 years, is the goal. And it's frankly because this work is really difficult. As I begin to describe our strategies, I think you'll begin to understand why some of this work is so challenging. Next slide. So our plan has 4 strategies, the first being leak reduction. So all of these places where refrigerants are out, preventing them from leaking, there's some clear ways in design that we can be doing a better job to prevent leakage. Reduce global warming potential of the refrigerants. So this is actually looking at different refrigerants, ones that are less harmful on that scale of, 9,000 to 1,000 times the global warming potential of CO2. Capture and destroy. So this is my favorite strategy. This is where we put a bounty on those really harmful refrigerants, and if HVAC contractors bring them to us, we would safely destroy them, and in return, carbon credit would be generated. So there's this whole opportunity to monetize that in a world where carbon credits have a value. And I don't know, a bounty on something is always fun, right? So then reduce volume of refrigerants. This just is about ways that we could be doing a better job of passive design. So think about all of the things that are refrigerated or air conditioned that might not need to be, or instances where we are leaving doors open. So I know lots of refrigerated cases, lots of situations where people are reaching in and out. But so these are generally the strategies that we put together around refrigerants. Next slide. Okay, so reduce the global warming potential of refrigerants. We included this case study on this slide of this HEB at Miller. It did a really great job of this. They used propane for the refrigerant at this store, and overall demonstrated a 45% reduction in energy use at this store. They brought together a lot of really innovative strategies. So next time you're grocery shopping at Miller, get curious about that store and how they did things differently. It's pretty unique and pretty intriguing. So this strategy is where we would develop a refrigerant destruction program. Could be run by the city, it could be run by a contractor. What we're asking is that it puts a price on older refrigerants, and also looking to look at codes in Europe, California, other places that are putting together codes that aggressively target greenhouse gas impacts of refrigerants, and implement those on a sooner timeline as possible. Next slide. Leak reduction. So the way that refrigerants work is they're basically chemical flowing through a pipe. And in our dogged pursuit of energy efficiency, we've really gone after economies of scale. So in many instances, what we found is that larger equipment could be more efficient. That said, in those cases, you have refrigerant that's going on long pathways through many tubes, many pieces of equipment. And oftentimes when you would have a leak, you wouldn't know that you had a leak until it had all leaked out and it was a very big leak. So what they're finding is that if you, as an alternate strategy, perhaps sacrifice some of the energy efficiency and go in with smaller cases, smaller units, smaller runs of refrigerant, they're finding significantly less leakage. So if you've got a leak, you know about it fast. One small piece of equipment stopped working, but you can then learn, like, why did this piece of equipment leak? Can I check that on the other cases? So this is an effort to really look at the ways that leaking is happening, particularly in restaurants, restaurant supply companies, refrigerated warehouses, and train people to prevent leaking. this is a huge opportunity for awareness and also education. It's been in Texas a historically known approach to, your air conditioning is down, it's 110 in Texas, and you are broke. So the air conditioning repairman says he can either replace your unit at a cost of several $1,000s or top up your refrigerant that should get you through the summer at a cost of $50, $100. And people are understandably making the choice to make the repair. But effectively, you're just allowing that refrigeration to leak into perpetuity. So it's going to take some serious behavior change and education to get at this problem and to come up with more responsible ways of addressing refrigerant leakage in the community. Next slide. Also reducing the volume of refrigerants. So again, this is an instance of design where, just putting doors on coolers, that sort of thing, can go a long way. This project, the Whole Foods at Arbor Trails, they also did a really great job of energy efficiency and looking at this in a mindful way. So again, another great example out in the wild, seeing how some people are taking leadership roles and it has impacts. So back to Phoebe with next steps.
All right, I had to unmute myself. So I'll just, thank you so much, Dirk and Sarah. And so just wanted to provide an overview of next steps. We mentioned that this is still in draft form. And so right now our team is, and different members of the advisory groups and steering committees are all putting our heads together into this one document and writing and rewriting and revising and editing and really trying to, we just recently made it into one life form. Originally it was like a bunch of separate documents. And so we are going to be working on cleaning this up, adding, pictures and making it nicer, or adding, at least what we want as far as graphics in descriptions and such. And so the idea is to have, once we get the plan all into one, then we have another kind of revision process where we show it to everybody in the advisory groups and steering committees, and we say, this is what the plan looks like as a whole. What do you think? What is your feedback? And so there's a lot of internal reviews as well within our own departments, making sure we have buy-in, making sure we kind of talk through some of these issues. What is this going to look like? What do we think? And then the hope is to get this into the hands of a designer who's going to make our plan look pretty. And then, of course, there'll be a public comment period in August. So at that point, we will put it up on our Speak-Up page, which I provided a link to if you get this PDF. But we do have a Speak-Up Austin page, which, there's a short survey there where you could give us some feedback on general thoughts on sustainability. And then eventually, I believe we'll upload the plan on there, and you can, there's a function where you can comment that's similar to what the Parks and Rec plan did. And so, lastly, the idea is to finalize everything and get it ready for council adoption in September. And I believe October 1st is the council meeting date that we're targeting. And so just wanted to let y'all know that there's a review process and there will be a public comment period to look out for in August. And so with that, we'll wrap up. This is our contact information. Here's the link to the Texas, austintexas.gov/climate plan. We'll keep you posted and has a bunch of links to different documents. You can snoop around and learn as much as you can. And then we also have the Speak-Up Austin page that we just mentioned. So thank you very much. And I'm not able to view the chat, so.
Yeah, I could. So I've been doing my best to facilitate collecting questions, so hopefully this works well enough, but keep all the great discussion in the chat going, and I'll try to make sure everything gets answered. And just as a reminder for everybody, if you look up in the chat and see there should be a link to a Google form, and that's how you can sign up for CLF Austin updates. And that's the list that we'll be using to send out all the information from this presentation. So please do that if you want the recording and you want the slides. But the first question was for Phoebe, and it's regarding the community climate plans. What was considered a quantitative action, and what tools were used to measure them?
For let me see. Regarding community. So are you talking about the previous community climate plan or the current one?
Let's go with current one.
Okay, so so right now what we're trying to do, as you saw in some of the goals and strategies, is that we are looking at % reduction of things. So we already know what the total is, and then so when we say quantitative, it's just really referring to something that can be easily measured. So to give you an example of like previously, you know, a strategy might have said, explore, you know, solar panels on roadways or solar PV on roadways, right? So it just says explore. So at the end of the day, when you're looking at, you know, whether or not we did this, well, we explored it, we didn't do it. And so that's kind of what we meant. And so now our goals are much more measurable. And so as far as, you know, how we're going to be able to measure everything, because this hasn't been implemented, I don't know that, you know, now we have that, but something that we, through the equity tool process, we've really figured out is that we want, you know, there to be data collection where it may not exist. And then we need to also make sure that we have access to the data that we need. And so that is a huge part, I think, of the accountability portion of this is to, you know, we have the GHG emissions data, right? But when it comes to some other, you know, health outcomes and, you know, energy burden outcomes, some of that data is much harder to get. And so that's part of, you know, I believe the process in ensuring that this will be implemented as such. So as of now, it's really in thinking about the ways the strategies were written to be more measurable, right? And that also gives more flexibility for implementation. So if we say you need to, you know, reach this goal by doing exactly this, and you don't allow flexibility, that also kind of holds back what, you know, the creativity of what can get done as far as ensuring that it's within, you know, the realm of what we can do from, you know, regulatory perspective and beyond.
Phoebe, this is Brandy. Can I add something real quick?
Yeah, sure.
This is Brandy Clark-Burton. I'm on the steering committee and I'm also on the consumption advisory group. And one of the things that is challenging about the consumption side is that we don't have great baselines. And so some of our goal setting, the initial bullet is like establish a baseline or measure X, you know, thing, and then reduce it from there by X%. So some of it is like clear, like she says, we have the baseline, and others are that we need to still establish those.
Yes, thank you for mentioning that. And that's part of what I think we also, Dirk also mentioned with the building materials, is that like we want to establish a baseline by 2025 to be able to reduce from there. But there's a lot of work in knowing what data we have and we don't have, and what we need to do to get it.
Right, and yeah, I do think that's a great segue kind of into the next question, which is about SE 2050. I saw people going back and forth about it in the chat. But Dirk, I don't know if you want to just give kind of an overview of what SE 2050 is doing and what they're trying to achieve, and maybe some of what the challenges are, because I know a lot of it is with benchmarking.
Yeah, happy to, and to move my other, you know, put on a different hat, so to speak. So very excited to see the excitement about SE 2050. And I think that Mark, looking at that, the equivalent to 2030 is the best analogy there. This is a program that's being developed right now. We were able to get the website up. We've fronted money of our own for a group of us, and we're getting people to sign up, though the mechanics of the program are being developed right now. So if there are structural engineers on this call who want to get engaged, let me know, and I will plug you in. And I guess others, I think it is great to plug SE 2050 and point people to that. So the big challenges that have been faced do relate to baseline, because for 2030, there is, you know, we have baselines, we have CBECs, we have those measurements. So understanding what that baseline is, if we were to set targets to say you need to measure from the baseline, that's what's really tricky. So SE 2050 is also working to develop a database, and we're talking to AA a lot and talking about the pros and cons of integrating into DDX, because there's actually other things that DDX doesn't have that we want to put in to get that to be able to form that baseline. But the part right now is to get the commitment. So where SE 2050 is right now, for clarity for people, we're planning to launch in November. There was an earlier letter asking for firms to encourage the Structural Engineering Institute, which is the AA equivalent for structural engineers, to support the initiative that many firms signed. And now a smaller group is forming the program. And we're looking at what it will be, and we're talking to AA about pros and cons of how 2030's worked. So I would be more than happy to talk to anyone if you have reported to 2030 and have complaints. Happy to listen to those, because we want to learn from that. And then the goal will be that firms report their numbers, but right now it will be reporting. The questions that come up then are what tools, what assumptions, what boundaries, what inventories were used to report these numbers. So at first it will be really a disclosure and transparency effort. So thanks, and happy to go into more if others want later.
Yeah, thanks, Dirk. So the next question I have is for Sarah, and it's for the HEB Miller project. You mentioned that propane reduced the impacts by 45%. So is that something that can be rolled out a lot more widely, or is there a reason that more people can't make that same change to achieve big reductions?
Yeah, that was just one of the many strategies that they deployed there. They really did a combo pack of everything they'd ever been like curious about. One store to try to figure out what worked and what didn't. We're working on another store with them. So it's interesting to see what plays out in terms of what was successful and what was not successful. And I think in some cases, they're learning a lot about durability and leaks. And obviously propane is this whole other thing, in that it's, you have I guess the world of refrigerants is complicated because there are chemicals that are explosive, and in some cases they're also a fossil fuel, or otherwise toxic. So I guess there's a lot of research being done. Natural refrigerants is one area of a lot of promise, and then all of the research being put into I guess chemicals that are not natural process, but it's a very closely regulated industry because of the safety concerns. And so when other organizations like, I guess, or other government entities have gone forward and adopted things to loosen up guidelines like Europe, they're getting feedback that maybe they did so too soon. So this isn't something where we want to be on the bleeding edge as a city, just because of the health impacts and concerns there. So I feel like this topic is one fraught with it's so complicated. Every time you move the needle in one direction, it's got an unintended consequence either in the ozone or health category. So we're just watching it closely and making the best decisions we can with as much information as we can. And it's a highly evolving subject.
Thank you. So the next question I have, and I guess this is for any of you that want to jump on it. So what are some of the biggest challenges or questions you have moving forward, and how can people kind of get involved to support and play a part in making these changes possible?
Yeah, I can take that. So, I mean, there are a lot of challenges, right? The goal that we're leaning towards from a, community-wide goal is very aggressive, and a lot of the, I think goals that we're setting within buildings and beyond are very aggressive. And so it's really going to take a lot of community action, right? A lot of partnerships. We emphasize partnerships with the embodied carbon, but that's really like a huge part of everything that we do. We need to make sure that we have buy-in from a lot of different industries. We need to make sure that we have awareness from people that are, not just people that are interested in environmentalism, but everybody, because this is something that everybody can benefit from. And every single person, turns on the lights or has a utility bill to pay. And so these are issues that affect everybody, but I think there's a lot of opportunity there to just make sure that we really make this a community plan. And so that's both a challenge and an opportunity, is that it's really aggressive and we're limited to some of the things that we can do from a regulatory perspective. And so we really need to make the case. We have a lot of persuasion to do for industries and people to want to do things on a voluntary basis, to make sure that we have the right incentives in place to have action. And so yeah, it's a big it's a big goal that we have, but it's just going to take a lot of cooperation. So that's just like an initial.
Yeah, can I comment one more time? This is Brandy. The first climate plan that the plan that was passed in 2015, even though it was called a community climate plan, really lacked community in terms of like widespread participation from the business community, from institutions, from like really changing behaviors. Not that people were trying to not do it, but it just, it wasn't like, okay, now let's get behind this. The time is now. Hopefully people have gotten a sense of urgency, that really we don't have any more time to mess around. But there's two things. One is we need massive cooperation with the goals that are set. And we're struggling on the steering committee with the fact that when we add up, like if you start from, okay, if we take this action, this action, this action, and add them up, we're not hitting our target goal. We don't reach net zero. We don't, we don't have the tools in place yet, even if we do everything we say we're going to do and everyone cooperates 100%. So we need people like bring in their creativity, not only participating to the max, but like, kind of game on, let's really see how to problem solve this. Because I'm a little like conflicted, because when you take the drawdown strategies and add them up, they say that we have enough, we have all the existing technology to not just slow down how fast we're messing things up on the planet, but to reverse global warming. But sort of what we see, we have access to tools here in Austin and things we have either control over or goals that we can set. We're not getting there. So we've got to mash up our collective power, what happens in the city, things we invest in, and the bigger picture as well. So everybody get your game hats on and let's play ball.
Absolutely, very inspiring. That was one of the things I really enjoyed, Phoebe, was how much you talked about how it's really intersectional, and there are so many issues, and it's not just about climate change necessarily, but it takes people working on all fronts. So does anybody else have any questions? I know we scheduled for 15 more minutes, but if not, then you can email CLF Austin. You can find us at clfatx@gmail.com, or you can email me personally. All of you should have that because you got the invite. Next month we're gonna have a casual kind of coffee break, not necessarily a happy hour because we can't really go out for a happy hour. And a month after that, we're going to be talking about the EC3 tool and LCA tools and whatnot. So make sure you sign up. I've seen a couple people signing up at the link that we provided. But if there's nothing else, I'm happy to hang out and chat for a little bit. But thanks everybody for coming. And that was some really great presentations. So thank you all for offering your time.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Where is can you tell the email address again? Because I just found this Zoom call on Facebook.
Oh, cool. Well, I didn't know we were advertising on Facebook, but that's exciting.
Well, AAGB, we had posted about it.
Oh, I see. Here, it's clfatx@gmail.com. I'll send it to the chat.
Okay, and we just emailed that for the recording and the Google form?
Here, I can post the Google form again because I think it's way at the top.
Okay. It's in the chat portion?
I just posted it in the chat.
Oh, I got you. Okay,
you see it? Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you'll start receiving all of our updates. And if you get annoyed at our updates, then we can stop sending you updates. But
oh, no, that's okay.
Hopefully it's not too much.
Let me just type with my big fingers on a little keyboard.
While she's typing, I just want to acknowledge Phoebe and the team at the Office of Sustainability who have led a process that I truly have never seen. Such follow through in the commitment to make sure that equity is built into every single step, and that that we check ourselves even in how we run our meetings and what we don't let anything slip through. Like, well, it's good for the planet. Screw the people. Like that is not going to fly. And